Good afternoon. My name is Bilgehan Alagöz. I am a senior expert at Center for Iranian Studies and also a full-time faculty at Istanbul's Marmara University. Before starting our sessions, I would like to draw attention to the morning session because I didn't have the opportunity to comment on the panel which was about Turkey's centennial. As Ambassador Jeffrey mentioned, there was an absence of Turkish citizen in the session. So I would like to mention that I feel very privileged to be a citizen of a democratic and secular country, and I owe all the rights I have as a Turkish citizen and a Turkish woman to the founder of my country, Mustafa Kemal Atatürk. So I wanted to mention this. Secondly, you all know we had a devastating earthquake in Turkey. We have lost more than 40,000 people. And I'm grateful for all our neighbors for their share of our sadness. And I would like to express to what extent I am also sad for our losses. And today's session is a joint session with Rudar Research Center and Center for Iranian Studies. I would like to introduce IRAM, our center, briefly. We were established in 2016 in Turkey, and we focus on Iranian politics. So we have publications, we organize meetings. If you are interested in our organization, you can visit our website. And today's session is titled as Continuity and Change in Iranian Politics. Iran is one of the influential states in our region, and it is always on the spotlight in terms of its domestic politics, in foreign policy. So today we are going to discuss with four distinguished guests both the domestic and foreign policies of the current government. And I'd like to introduce our guests briefly. Dr. Hassan Ahmadian is coming from Tehran. He's an assistant professor at the University of Tehran. Dr. Veen came from Brussels. He is head of the Middle East program at Clingendael Conflict Research Unit. Dr. Hakkı Uygur is the president of IRAM, and lastly, Dr. Parwez Rahim is a lecturer at Salahaddin University. Thank you for accepting to be a speaker in our session. So my time is very limited. I don't want to spend my time. I will start with Dr. Hassan Ahmadian. Once again, thank you, Hassan, for accepting to be speaker in this panel. We all wonder Iran's current foreign policy. Yesterday, we also had a roundtable about Iran's nuclear program. So today, we won't have any time to discuss the details. But recently, also, the International Atomic Energy Agency has published a report about Iran's nuclear activities. But my question will be more general. According to you, what is the government of Ibrahim Raisi's top priority in terms of foreign policy? Do you see a change or continuity in Raisi's foreign policy? I would be very pleased if you also mention the pros and cons of the look to the East policy. So you have 10 minutes. At the end of the session, I will try to get the questions from the audience. Thank you. The floor is yours.
Hello. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Bilgehan, and thanks to Rodau and both IRAM and Rodau for co-organizing this meeting. It's hard to get the attention of folks in the room after this interesting meeting, previous one. So with regards to your question, I'll be brief as you asked me to be. I think Iran's foreign policy is basically, economics and security concerns have dictated and are dictating Iran's foreign policy in the region and beyond. When President Raisi was elected, it has been 4 years since President Trump withdrew from the JCPOA, imposed maximum pressure on Iran. Now, President Biden, when coming to office, he reversed many of Trump's policies globally, but he didn't do that with regards to Iran, because the feeling was that there is too much to lose there. There's a lot of leverage. We can use it to change the situation and extract more concessions from Iran. That did not happen, and to this day, we are in a continuous process of negotiation, pause, and then negotiations again. And the report you referred to is part of this, ups and downs in the road of the Iranian nuclear program and negotiations on it, and Iran-West relations in general. Now, when President Raisi was elected, he was elected on a campaign that in terms of foreign policy differed a bit from the previous administration in terms of his focus on rising powers, the East as it is called in Iran, namely China, Russia, India maybe, and then Iran's neighborhood policy that he talked about a lot. These both became the primary concerns for his administration in terms of foreign policy. Rouhani's discussions with in the latest year during the Biden administration, after the inauguration of President Biden, didn't lead to anything. So Raisi came to the office with the premise that the West is not changing its attitude towards Iran. They don't want to normalize their relations with Iran. So the answer to the question as to what to do moving forward was a look to the East and a more sort of neighborly policy. Let me speak about these two aspects of his foreign policy a bit. I think the look to the East is not a novel idea pertaining to President Raisi's administration. It was the first time it was mentioned during Ahmadinejad's presidency. It was hinted at, wasn't a serious strategic shift, but still it showed a growing concern with the relationship with the West. So people were starting to look eastwards. And I think President Rouhani changed that course, changed the dynamics, changed the mentality, and he went for a negotiation with the West that led the administration to sign the JCPOA, the Iran nuclear deal, with the P5+1. Now that you know what happened to in 2018, President Trump withdrew from and imposed the maximum pressure on Iran. So the fate of the JCPOA played a crucial role in turning Iran's attention from the West, negotiation with the West, to the East, looking eastwards. But it wasn't only about the JCPOA. The international conditions also helped that look to the East. China, under the U.S. strategy of moving to Asia or pivot to Asia, also was more interested in moving ahead with its relations with Iran. For the first time, they signed a 25-year agreement to enhance ties in different ways. And also, under President Raisi, Iran became full member of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. And last month, according to a Reuters report, China's import of Iranian oil rose up above 1 million, which is huge. So with regards to China, things are moving very fast, I guess. With regards to Russia, also the international conditions played a key role here. The Ukrainian war, the tragic war on Ukraine, led Iran into a different, dealings with Russia. Ties enhanced big times. The two countries moved to close coordination on international and regional issues, and also trade rose up. Technology cooperation also rose up to a large extent. Iran's capacity and income out of its transit routes that were there were not used before the Ukraine war, but now they are in full capacity working, and I think that has also added to the dynamism of Iran-Russia relations. So look to the east seems to be paying off, where Iran-West relations are stagnant and put on hold to a large extent. With regards to the second parcel of Raisi's foreign policy, and I'll be quick, the regional, what it's called in Iran, the neighborhood policy, it has basically two meanings: lowering tensions with countries that Iran is not in good terms with, and namely Saudi Arabia comes to mind here, but also other countries, and also enhancing ties with those who Iran has been on good terms with. And if you look at President Raisi's foreign trips, he focused on both. Look to the east, main trips to the east, to eastern countries, but also to the region. No presidential trip to the west, nothing. So I think that's also an indication of the Raisi administration in its foreign policy approach. And if I put it in a more broad sort of framework, there are two ways of looking at foreign policy in Iran, has been always the case. The internationalist one, which see the international interaction as the way forward to deal with the region, which President Rouhani used to do or believe in, and another one which is more sort of regionalist. It looks at foreign policy, the regional trend and the regional track as a separate yet related, but separate track that Iran should move towards, despite its way of relations with international actors. President Raisi made it obvious that he belongs to the regionalist approach. He started the regionalist track, and Iraq played a key role in mediating Iran's relations with many of regional countries, including Saudi Arabia. There have been discussions with more than Saudi Arabia on regional files. And I think both trends have been paying off for Iran to a large extent. I'll stop there and look forward to the discussion.
It's okay. You still have 2 minutes.
I'm fine.
Okay.
I think I can.
Okay, thank you, Hassan, also for being stick to the timeline. I will probably have questions to you. And you mentioned the Russia-Ukraine war, which is on the agenda of the European Union. So I have a guest who is coming from Brussels, Dr. Erwin. Erwin, I think there are two main issues in front of the EU regarding Iran. One is Iran's role in Russia-Ukraine war, and the other one is Iran's nuclear activities. So can you briefly draw a framework for the European approach towards Iran based on these current circumstances? You still have 10 minutes.
Well, thank you so much. And a warm thank you to the organizers of this conference to begin with. It's a real pleasure to be here with you today. So I think if we connect the war in the Ukraine with the nuclear deal negotiations and the position of the European Union, it's fairly easy to say, I think, that the war in the Ukraine has been a game changer for the relations between the European Union and Iran on several different dimensions. Yeah? And I think the most important one, thank you. The most important one, I think, is that Iranian support for the Russian armed forces, even though it is very similar to what the West is doing with respect to the Ukraine, of course, has added to the negative perceptions that have always been there, but have especially developed in the wake of the various protests that have taken place in Iran in 2019 and 2022. And the effect of that is further diminishment of any EU political willingness to basically support the revival of the nuclear deal, which admittedly was very limited to start with. But the recent events have obviously not supported a positive evolution of this view. And I think the other consideration that is important to entertain with regard to the war in the Ukraine is that at many different levels you could defend the position that Russia made a serious strategic mistake by invading the Ukraine, and that irrespective of the outcome of the war, it already lost on several dimensions, not the least the cultural attractiveness of Russians, of Russian Federation, of Russian, the language, the culture, the reaction we're seeing in the Ukraine, and the fact that this kind of led to the final battle of the Cold War, in a sense, right, in 2023. And so if it doesn't end well, you know, in different senses for Russia, then that is likely to have consequences for Iran as well. As Mr. Ahmadian just argued, Russia is much more needful of Iran at present. The relationship has been strategically upgraded. But what is the future of this relationship? If Russia doesn't come out of the conflict, it might actually be quite positive for Iran, because a weaker Russia means it will be more dependent on its relationship with Iran and China. But it also means that China remains the only viable partner for Iran is in a situation where there is no revival of the nuclear deal. The sanctions regime remains in place. And Iran is basically, doesn't even have the choice of turning east. It will have to turn east because there is no alternative. And this might be able to generate enough resources and progress to scrape by for the Iranian government and the basic needs of its economy, but it's certainly not going to allow Iran to maximize its national development potential. So it will continue to act as a drain on national development. So in the context of that situation, it is kind of unsurprising that both parties, I mean the US and Europe as well as Iran, currently think that time is on their side with regard to the nuclear negotiations. Iran is in a strong position in the short term, and the US and the Europeans likely expect to be in a stronger position in the medium term. So the net effect is that these negotiations are basically over. The nuclear deal has been mummified, it's not active. It may be revived, but it's unlikely for this to happen because none of the parties is willing to put a type of concessions or big gestures on the table that could revitalize the mistrust that exists. And I don't want to go too much into the history of how we got to this point, and obviously the US made sort of the second biggest policy blunder of the 21st century by quitting the nuclear deal in 2018. And the EU has not covered itself with any glory in terms of stepping up in its defense of the agreement. But we are where we are. And the reality is that I think this agreement is unlikely to be revived, which means that we will have to prepare for a much more ambiguous future in which Iran is quite likely to undertake several activities that might ultimately lead to the possession of a nuclear weapon, and prepare for the different scenarios that this might take the shape of. And then I get to my final point. I think this will be much less of a concern in the EU than it is in the United States, for the simple reason that the EU essentially has a regional security policy and not a global one. We talk about the EU very lightly, but it's basically a semi-voluntary association of 27 countries. And 3/4 of them don't really care about the nuclear deal, or Iran for that matter, because their regional policy, their foreign policy is regional and not global. So I think in the end that will not change much in the relation between the EU and Iran. It's a different story for the United States, obviously, given its global security interests. But even then, the turn to China and the war in the Ukraine have essentially deprioritized the nuclear deal and the relationship with Iran. So this is how I arrive at the conclusion that there is not much prospect for a revival of the nuclear deal, and sort of the different impacts it will have on both Iran, the US, and the European Union. Perhaps that gives us some food for thought for later discussion. Thank you, Bilgehan.
Thank you, Erwin. At this point, I want to continue with Hakkı. Iran is not only under the spotlight because of its foreign policy, but also it is very kept track of the international community because of the protests in the aftermath of Mahsa Amini's suspicious death. So there have been many analyses about these protests. People are wondering whether there is a change inside Iran. There is a Gen Z, there are university students. So, Hakkı, can you draw a framework about these protests? Because there have been other protests up until now, especially since the Islamic Revolution. Do you see any difference between these protests and the recent ones, or is it just a continuity in Iranian society?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Bilgehan, and thank you very much for Rudolph Resource Center for inviting us. Before answering your question, I would like to mention some important points on the country's main policy approaches. As my colleagues also explained, while we see some changes in foreign policy of Iran, there are some major dimensions which we barely see any change during the time. This change and continuity, of course, is not limited to Iran and not just about the foreign policy. Today, as just you mentioned, I would like to talk from domestic policy perspective since the revolution of 1979, and particularly will try your question whether the latest protest inside Iran is signaling for a new revolution, or as some experts argue, or these movements are quite predictable and just adjusting some social changes into daily social and cultural implementations. To reach my main point, I would like to go back to 1979 Islamic Revolution, which I believe has been one of the most important milestones in the wider region. Iranian people from all social groups and different ideologies joined this social uprising, and finally they created a new Islamic Republic. As you know, we are coming from Turkey, and as just Bilgehan mentioned, we had a very big earthquake just a few weeks ago. So inspiring from this earthquake, also it was disaster, but I could compare this 1979 revolution with a big earthquake. It destroyed everything. It was very important, but it was not the end of the story. So until today, we see lots of earthquakes and, aftershocks. Remembering, a lot of major developments after the revolution, such as tough domestic violence between revolutionaries, 8-year war with Iraq, some amendments in constitution after Khomeini's death in 1989, and the diplomatic agreement as known JCPOA with United States, etc. If we look at this 44-year carefully, we see that whenever it's necessary to adopt a major change, governments in Iran have not hesitated to take steps in this regard. We remember that these steps formalized as drinking poison by Khomeini in 1988, or heroic flexibility in 2015 by Khamenei. Although these two steps are directly related to foreign policy, first one to put an end to 8-year war with Iraq, and second one to shake hands with Grey Satan United States in JCPOA. However, both show us how the state in Iran could take radical decisions when it comes to national security interests. Even in terms of domestic policy, someone living in Iran or observing Iran very closely could easily see that lots of daily implications and politics have been changed during the last 4 decades. For example, Mohammed Khatami's government and his policies were very different than Mr. Ahmadinejad's, who used internal and international atmosphere to calm power after US invasion of Iraq and Afghanistan. Another example from daily life, I remember wide discussions among clerics, journalists, and academics in 90s and 2000s around video players, satellite channels, or internet access for public, or the obligatory chadar for university students. These examples are showing that Iranian society and even political life is quite dynamic, even though sometimes difficult to understand from outside. If we go back to main topic, recent process inside Iran and roots and consequences of it, there are two major narratives on that by officials inside the country and by opposition groups, especially outside of the country. While police forces claim that Mahsa Amini, the young woman who was taken into custody to not wear Islamic dress, has lost her life due to some previous disease, and published a video from inside the police center to empower their claim, opposition groups, on the other hand, strongly denied these claims and claimed she was killed by police forces. Regardless of which one of claims are true, in my opinion, too much focusing on the reason of the death leading us to wrong direction about the real dynamics of the recent social protests inside the country. Here, I would like to answer your question. Recent protests showed us, although according to some surveys, most of the people supported demonstrations or feel very uncomfortable with the current situation inside Iran. Interestingly, however, it is difficult to claim that majority of society joined the people in the streets. I mean, as we know, the ethnic or religious minorities, middle classes, and economically disadvantaged people inside the country almost making 90% of the society. And despite this fact, and although demonstration took place, almost every single city of the country in the first place, but soon it turned some certain cities which have special backgrounds, such as Kurdistan and Balochistan provinces. So again, if I answer the first question, what is the difference these recent protests and others? You know, lots of groups inside Iran felt solidarity with protests in the first stage, then universities and minority areas took the initiative and became prominent. In this sense, we need to also underline the capacity and capability of the Iranian government to handle this kind of protest. Since first day of the revolution in 1979, government faced with dozens of social unrest until today, which 1999 Tehran University protests, 2009 Green Movement, and 2018 to 19 oil price protests are among them. Even since then, we saw lots of news in Persian media especially, reporting that, government preparing itself for more social uprising and increasing budget of some police forces and buying some surveillance equipments from China. But what is different this time, maybe we could emphasize on diaspora groups and media outlets in organizing and orchestrating the streets. London-based TV channels like Iran International and BBC Persian particularly played a very significant role in this term. And Tehran immediately announced that it will consider Iran International Channel as a terror organization. Moreover, Berlin Gathering was the biggest demonstration of Iranian people took place anywhere in the world. And another important point, Ukraine war and Iran's involvement in the war by selling weapons to Russia affected Western powers' reaction to the situation, and we saw some opposition figures could have meetings with important European leaders or participating in international significant events. It seems that unless United States and Iran found a common ground in JCPOA negotiation, Western countries will increase their support to opposition groups. Another point I would like to mention, the power struggle between ruling elites. I care this issue more than street protests. because it's a serious tension inside Iranian state structure. We know that until today there have been two major groups inside the government, conservatives and moderates or reformists, and they played their roles very well until today. However, with the election of Ibrahim Raisi government, this balance has gone and all governmental positions have taken by just one conservative group. Now there is just one political perspective and there is no balance, for instance, between Minister of Foreign Affairs and IRGC commanders. When we look at the Raisi government, we see plenty of IRGC commanders, police chiefs, intelligence officers, etc. Even this kind of composition is seen in JCPOA delegation. It will absolutely decline flexibility of decision makers in domestic and foreign policy issues. But the more important thing is while the opposition group outside of the country unifying their position and organizing joint events for the first time after the revolution, insider opponents such as Mir Hussein Musavi also declares very radical change in its views and suggesting a referendum for a new constitution. Still, it's not clear how much the main body of reformist group inside the country supporting his position, yet it's quite significant change for someone like former Prime Minister of Khomeini. So I think in short term we could see major political steps inside the country in terms of domestic policy to repair this kind of growing dissatisfaction among the political elites. Even I wouldn't be surprised if Mr. Raisi was not elected for the second time, and it's absolutely rare issue for any president in Iran. Finally, the last point, what is the most fundamental demand of society and government is ready for that or not? Actually, in this part of the world, all societies are similar to each other and have similar demands as we witnessed during the Arab Spring. I mean freedom, transparency, economic development, equality, democratic state, etc. When it comes to Iran, Islamic Republic is clearly interrupting in daily life of its citizens more than any other nation in the region. And every day, young generation, especially middle-class women, which are facing more discriminative implementation of the social rules, are getting angrier and protester. That's why even before the Mahsa Amini's death, that's why even before the Amini demonstration took place, we already saw that this kind of limitations getting less and less in the society. But this unfortunate incident clearly showed that the young generation is asking for faster reforms in these issues. Mm-hmm. Lastly, in my personal opinion, Iranian state has enough experience to handle this issue to satisfy or decline the level of dissatisfaction of the middle class groups. I think we will see in the near future less ideological or religious implementations and more nationalist and militarist rhetoric to convince young generation and ordinary people in the future again, as political leaders understand very well the old-style Islamic or Shiite slogans or ideals are not attractive or convincing as they used to be. If any question, I would answer. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Hakkı. And lastly, Parwez, I'm gonna ask you some questions about Iran's involvement here in Iraq. Since you are an Iraqi citizen, you would probably tell us what the Iraqis are thinking about Iran's activities inside Iraq. Do you believe that Iran can put a balance in the region and also have good relationship with the neighborhood? Again, the floor is yours.
Thank you. زۆر سپاس. دەزانی پرسی ئێران یەکێک لە پرسە ئاڵۆزەکانی ئێستا ناوچەکەیە. چەند شتێک باز دەکەین بۆی کە بینە ناو سیاسەتی ئێران لە عێراقێ. یەکەم شت گۆڕانی سەرۆکۆمار گۆڕان بەسەر سیاسەتی دەرەوەی ئێراندا نایەنێ، چونکە سەرۆکۆمار دەسەڵاتێکی ئەوتۆی نییە، بەڵکو جێبەجێکاری سیاسەتەکانی ئەوەی کە ئێرانەکان پێی دەڵێن نظام کە ڕێبەری باڵا و دامەزراوەکانی دایدەڕێژن. ئەمە یەکەم. خاڵی دووەم سیاسەتی ئێران هەر بەرزی و نزمیەک پەیوەندی بە کۆمەڵێک فاکتەری ناوخۆیی لە ژینگەی با بڵێین دەرەکیدا کە ڕوودەدا و ئەو مەترسیانەی کە ڕوبەڕووی دەبنەوە ئەو گوشارە سیستەمیانە. خاڵی سێیەم دەگەڕێتەوە سەر ناسنامەی تایبەتی کۆماری ئیسلامی کە سیاسەتەکانی ئاراستە دەکات لە عێراق و پێیوی پێناسەی دۆست و دوژمن دەکرێت. ئەم سێ خاڵە زۆر مهمە. لە دوایین گۆڕانکاریەکاندا ئەوە ڕوویدا با لە دوایە با بچینەوە لەسەر سیاسەتی ئێران قسە بکەین. لە دوو وێستگا نیشانیان داوە سیاسەتی ئێران لە عێراق ڕۆبڕووی شکست بۆتەوە. 2019 بەهۆی ئەو خۆپێشاندانە بەرفراوانە جەماوەریەی کە سەرکوت کرا کە دروشمەکان داوای ئەویان دەکرد ئێران دەست لە کاروباری ناوخۆی عێراق نەدا. 2021 کە هێزەکانی لایەنگری ئێران کە دەناسران نزمترین دەنگیان هێنا. باشە کە گۆڕانکاری دوو گۆڕانکاری یعنی لە ئاستی فەرمی سیاسی و لە ئاستی جەماوەریدا. ئێستا ئەگە بمانەوێ بزانین لە بنەمای سیاسەتکردنی ئێران لە عێراقی چیە بەپێی ئەو ڕوقسێتەوەرە باسمان کرد، گرنگترین خاڵ ئەوەیە کە ئاماژەی پێ بکەین کە لە پاش ساڵی 2003 ئێران تووشی دڵەڕاوکەیەکی ئاسایشی بوو کە ئەمریکا هاتە سنوورەکانی و بە ئاشکرا باس لەوە دەکرا کە وڵاتی سێیەم لەوانەیە کۆماری ئیسلامی بێ. ئەمە وای کرد تەنانەت لە فترەیەک ئێران بە ناڕاستە و خۆ و بەنهێنی هاوکاری ئەمریکا بکە. ئەمە لەوانەیە بۆ خەڵکی ئاسایی زۆر سیر بێ ئەوەی کە دروشمەکەی مەرگ بەر ئەمریکایە دێ بەنهێنی لەگەڵ ئەمریکایە گفتوگۆش دەکا و هاوکاریشی دەکا. ئەمە نیشان لە جۆرە سیاسەتێک دەدا کە لە ژینگەی ئاسایشی ئێران وای لێ دەکا کە لە ئەو دروشمانەی لەو نۆرمە ناسنامەیەی کە بۆ خۆی پێناسەی کردووە پاشەکشە بکە. باش 2003 ڕووداوی زۆر گەورە ڕوودەدا لە ناوچەکە. کۆماری ئیسلامی گەورەترین دوژمنی بەدەستی دوژمنێکی تری لە ناو دەچێت. سەرڕای ترس و دڵەڕاوکێ و هەڕەشە ئێران ئەمە دەکاتە دەرفەت. شیعەکان لە پەراوێزەوە دەبنە دەسەڵات. کۆماری ئیسلامی وا لێ دەکا کە تەنانەت پاشەکشە بە ئەمریکای بکا 2011 لە ژێر گوشاری ئێرانە کە ئەمریکا عێراق بەجێ دێڵێ. باشە؟ جا یەکەم خاڵ کە سیاسەتی ئێران لە عێراق ئاراستە دەکا دڵنیابوون لە بەردەوامی دەسەڵاتی شیعەکانە. ئەوە پەیوەندی بە فاکتەرێکی ناسنامەیی هەیە کە دڵنیایی ناسنامەیی و بەردەوامی دەدا بە کۆماری ئیسلامی. دووەم خاڵ ڕێگەگرتن لە باڵادەستی هەر هێزێکی نەیار یان ڕکابەری ئێرانە لە عێراق. بۆ نمونە ویلایەتە یەکگرتووەکانی ئەمریکا نابێ بتوانێت هاوپەیمانەیەکی بەهێز بێ لە عێراق یان زاڵ بێ سعودیا و تەنانەت تورکیا کە پەیوەندی هەیە لەگەڵ ئێران ئاسایی، بەڵام نابێ ئەوان زاڵ بن. جا دەڵێم ئەم چەمکێکی هەیە چی پێ دەڵێن. خاڵی سێهەم ئەوەیە کە ڕێگە لە دووبارە گەڕانەوەی بە فۆرمی جا دەسەڵاتێکی پان عەرەبیستی بەعسی سونیەکان بگرێ. خاڵی چوارەم ئەوەیە کە عێراق دابەش نەبێ. ئەمە ڕووداوەکانی 16 ئۆکتۆبرمان لەبیرە کە کۆماری ئیسلامی ڕۆڵی سەرەکی تێدا هەبوو بە ئاشکراش و بێ شاردنەوەش. خاڵێکی تر ئەوەیە کە لە عێراقێدا هەمیشە ئەو دەسەڵاتی شیعەش کە لەسەر دەسەڵاتە دەسەڵاتێک نەبێ کە ناسنامە عەرەبیەکەی بەرە وڵاتانی بابڵیا کۆمەلگای عەرەبی ڕابکێشێ. ئەمە لە دوایین هەڵبژاردنمان بینیمان کە ئێران بە هیچ شێوازێک ڕازی نەبوو و بیرتان دێنمەوە ساڵی 2018 عەلی ئەکبەر ویلایەتی وەزیری پێشووتری دەرەوەی ئێران و ڕاوێژکاری ئایەتوڵا خامنەیی لە پاش هەڵبژاردنەکان ئەگەر لە بیرتان بێت سەدرەکان هاوپەیمانێکیان پێکێنابوو دەگەڵ شیوعەکان وتی ئێمە لێ ناگەڕێین لیبراڵەکان و شیوعەکان لە عێراق دەسەڵات بگرن دەست ئەو کاتی لە بیرمە زۆر ڕوبەڕووی ڕخنەیەکی یەکجار زۆر بۆ وەک ئەمە دەستێوەردانە بەڵام بە ئاشکرا ئەم شتەیان کتۆ و نەشیان شاردۆتەوە خاڵێکی تر ئەوەیە لە ڕووی ئابووریەوە عێراق یەکێک لە بەهێزترین و وەختە بڵم تاکە دەواازەیە بۆ شکاندنی ئابلۆقە و سزانیە دەوڵەتیەکان ئەو ڕووداوانەی دوایی وشارەکانی ئەمریکا لەسەر عێراق پرسی دابەزینی نرخی دینار لە بەرامبەر دۆلاری ئەمریکایی ئەوانە بێننەوە یادتان لەگەڵ ئەوەی کە ئێران نایهەوێ عێراق بەتایبەت لە ڕووی گازی سروشتیەوە ببێتە بەدیلی بۆ ئێران یەک لە ڕووی ئابووریەوە زیانێتی دوو لە هاوکێشەکاندا هەست پێ دەکا کە پەراوێز دەکەوێ و نایهەوێ لایەن و وڵاتانی تر لەم ڕێگەیەوە عێراق داببڕن کۆی ئەمانە لە پاڵ ئەوەی کە عێراق یەکێک لە گرنگترین ناوچەکانە بۆ بەڕێوەبردننی ململانەکانی ئێران لەگەڵ وڵاتانی تر ئەوەی کە بە جەنگی نوێنەرایەتی ناوی دەبن بۆیە زۆنی خۆڵەمێشیە عێراق و بۆیەشە موشک لە ناوڕاستی هەولێر دەدا پەیام بۆ لایەنەکان ململانی لەگەڵ ئیسرائیل لێرەیەک لا دەکرێتەوە و بۆیەشە دەبینین کە بارگرژی دەگاتە ئاستێکە بەڵام لێ ناگەڕە پێکدادان چونکە زۆنی خۆڵەمێشی ئەو گرەی زۆنە تایبەتمەندێکی هەیە کە ناگاتە جەنگێکی ڕاستە و خۆی گەرم باشە بۆیە بەردەوام لێرە قەیران ڕوودەدا و ئەمە یەکجار زۆر گرینگە کە عێراق تەنیا لە ڕووی کللتوریەوە لەژێر نفوزی ئێراندا نییە بەپێی استراتیژی سیاسەتی دەرەکی و ئاسایشی نەتەوەیی ئێران بەڵکو هاوکات ئامرازێکیشە بۆ یەکلاییکردنەوەی ململانیەکان و بەکارهێنانی هێز و گروپەکان لەو ململانیانە کە ئەمریکا بیهەوێ شتێک بە دژی ئێران بکات لە عێراق دەبێ یەکلایی بکرێتەوە ئەوە جگەلەوەی دوایین یا دەیەمین خاڵ بریتیە لەوەی کە عێراق ڕۆڵی ئاڵقەی پێکگەیشتنی هیلالی شیعی دەگێڕێ بۆ استراتیژی سیاسەتی دەرەکی کۆماری ئیسلامی کە ئەگەر عێراق بوونی نەبێ و لایەنگرانی عێراق لێرە بوونیان نەبێ ئێران ناتوانێت بێ ئەو ململانێ ناسنامەیە کە دەگەڵ بۆ نمونە ئیسرائیل هەیتی جادێم بە کورتی باسیەوەی دەکەم مەگە دەرفەتە بێ کە بۆ هیچ کاتێک ئێران ناتوانێت پەیوەندێکی ئاسایی لەگەڵ ئەمریکا و ئیسرائیل و ئەوانە هەبێ چونکە ئەمە لە ڕووی ناسنامەییەوە کێشەی بۆ دروست دەکات کێشەی وجودی بۆ دروست دەکات ئەم هیلالە شیعەتدا پچڕانێکی گەورەی بۆ دروست دەبێ ناگاتە سووریای لە سووریاش ناگاتە لوبنان لە لوبنانیش ئەو هێزانە و فلستین و ململانەکانی دەهوێت لە دەرەوەی هەر کاتێک عێراق لەژێر هەژمونی ئێران دەرچوو دڵنیا بن گۆڕانێکی زۆر گەورە ڕوودەدا چ لە ناوخۆی کۆماری ئیسلامی و کۆماری ئیسلامی ئەم ڕاستیانە دەزانێت بۆیە زۆر هەستیارە بە هەر ئاڵ و گۆڕێک لە ژینگەی ئاسایشیەکەی کە دەگەڕێتەوە سەر پرسی ناسنامەکەی.
Parwez, sorry to interrupt. Can you briefly tell yourself?
بۆ خۆشمە تەواو
It's okay.
ماوە نیە؟ باش. ئەوانە هەموو لەلایەک لێرەدا پرسێکی زۆر گرنگ هەیە کە کۆماری ئیسلامی سیاسەتێکی تریش بەڕێوە دەبا هاوکات ڕۆڵی باڵانسێر دەبینێ بە چ معنایەک ئێوە سیرکەن جگەلەوەی کە لێناگەڕێ لەگەڵ لایەنێکی شیعی لایەنەکانی تر کورد سوننا ئەوەی کە لە نمونەی دوایین هەڵبژاردندا بینیمان کە لە سەدرریەکان هاوکات لەناو هیچ کام لە پێکاتەش لێناگەڕێ پێکاتەیەکی بەهێز و کەسێک کۆنتڕۆڵی ئەم سێ پێکاتە سەرەکێ بکە لە کورد لێناگەڕێ لە سونەژ ڕێگە نادا کە سونە بەردەوام ترسی هەیە و لە ناو شیعەژ ڕێناگەڕێ مرکزیەتێک دروست بێ و ئەمە لە دواییدا خۆی کۆیان دەکاتەوە خۆی کوردیش کۆ دەکاتەوە شیعەش کۆ دەکاتەوە سونە و پاشان بەپێی ئەو فۆرمە دڵخوازەی وی کە باسم کرد لە خاڵی یەکەم خاڵێکی تری زۆر گرنگ لە ڕووی مەرجعیەتی ئاینیەوەیە کۆماری ئیسلامی ئەم ڕەوایەتەی کە وەردەگرێ بەپێی ئەم ناسنامە ئایدۆلۆژی ئیسلامی و شیعیە لێرە ناگەڕێ نەجەف ببێتە ئەو ناوەندە لە جیهانی ئیسلام کە لە بەرامبەر قومدا با ئەوان دانی پیانەنێن یا بڵێن ناهاریەکە یەک نییە لێرە دوو جیهانە کە ڕەگەزە نەتەوەیەکە جیای دەکاتەوە لێرە فارسی شیعی لێرە عەرەبی با بڵین شیعی ئەوەی نەجەفووە نەجا بە هەر هۆکارێک بەرز و نزمی تێدایە دوو پرسی یەکجار زۆر گرنگن بۆ پاش ڕووداوەکانی جەنگی ئێران و عێراق و مەترسی هەڵگیرسان ئەگە لە بیرتان بێ لە هەشتاوەشتوانە کە لە چەند پاپۆر ئێراندرا لە چەند دامەزراوەی نێوتی دراوە تەنانەت فڕۆکەیەکی نەفەر هەڵگری ئێرانی کەوتە خوارەوە 290 کەس ئەگە هەڵە نەبم تێدا کوژرا ئێران زۆر هەستی بەدڵ ڕاوکێ کرد بەرەبەرە دوو جەمسەری کۆتایی پێهات هەموو ئەم گۆڕانکاریانە وای کرد کە ئێران هەوڵ بدا لە ڕێی ئەوەی کە پێ دەڵێن هێزی ناهاوتەریب ئەوەی کە ئەوان پێی دەڵێن خۆیان چەمکێکیان هەیە لە ئەدەبیاتی ئاسایشی نەتەوەی و سیاسەتی بەرگریان پێی دەڵێن جەنگی نامتەقارن زۆر کار لەسەروەی دەکا هەستی کرد ئەو هێزە نایەکسانە هاوکات پەرەپێدان بە پرسی موشکی و درۆن و تەنانەت پەرەپێدانی توانای ئەتۆمی لە پاڵ ئەو سێ کوچکەیە کە باسم کرد کە دروستی دەکا و هیندێک گروپی لایەنگری خۆی پاشان پێکیان دێنێتەوە یعنی ئێران ڕەگەزە ئایدۆلۆژی و مەسەبیەکان هاوکات ململانی جیۆپۆلیتیکیکانیش بەکاردێنێت لە ئەم هاوکێشەیەی کە لە عێراقدا خۆی ئەم دەخاڵەدا خاڵی جێگیرن لە سیاسەتی ئێران لە عێراق زۆر سپاس.
Sorry, we are running out of time. I have a very limited time, but at least I can get one question from the audience. No? A very quick question. Is there any question for our speakers? No. Okay.
It's time for women.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I have to finish at this point. Once again, thanks you for enabling this opportunity for all of us. And it has been a very successful forum. Once again, thank you, Rudav Research Center. And thank you for being the speaker.